He was 19 years old when the war handed him a pair of wings. In the summer of 1940, the sky over Britain had already become a battlefield. The German Luftwaffe was preparing to crush the Royal Air Force and open the way for invasion. Across airfields in southern England, young pilots, many barely out of school, were being rushed through training and sent into combat. Among them was a quiet, determined teenager named Geoffrey Wellum. Wellum had grown up in London, fascinated by aircraft. Like many boys of his generation, he watched planes trace white lines across the sky and imagined himself inside the cockpit. But imagination turned into urgency when Europe began to fall. After Germany invaded Poland in 1939 and war was declared, Britain faced an existential threat. By 1940, the need for fighter pilots was desperate. At just 18, Geoffrey volunteered for the Royal Air Force. He was accepted into training, where the transition from civilian life to military discipline was immediate and brutal. There was no time for hesitation. Britain was losing aircraft and pilots faster than they could be replaced. Training began with basic instruction, navigation, aerodynamics, gunnery, and endless hours memorizing emergency procedures. The young recruits were expected to absorb months of knowledge in weeks. Every mistake in the air could be fatal. Engines failed, aircraft stalled, students sometimes did not return. Yet Geoffrey proved capable. He showed natural coordination and an instinctive feel for flying. Soon he progressed to advanced training and found himself climbing into the cockpit of the aircraft that would define his generation, the Supermarine Spitfire. The Spitfire was unlike anything he had flown before. Sleek, fast, and responsive, it was Britain's answer to the German Messerschmitt Bf 109. Powered by the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, it could climb rapidly and turn tightly, advantages that would prove crucial in dogfights. But it was also unforgiving. A careless movement on the controls could send the aircraft into a spin. For Geoffrey, climbing into a Spitfire for the first time was both thrilling and terrifying. The cockpit was cramped, the canopy closed him in, and the Merlin engine roared only inches ahead of him. The machine felt alive. By the summer of 1940, the Battle of Britain was underway. German bombers, escorted by fighters, crossed the English Channel daily, targeting airfields, radar stations, and cities. The Royal Air Force was stretched to its limits. Losses mounted. Then came the order that would change everything. On June 10, 1940, Geoffrey Wellum was posted to No. 92 Squadron. He was 19 years old, the youngest pilot in his squadron. Most of the other men were in their early 20s, but even they seemed seasoned compared to him. Some already had seen combat. Some bore quiet signs of strain. He tried not to show fear. The airfield buzzed with tension. Ground crews worked non-stop, refueling and rearming aircraft between sorties. Pilots gathered in briefing rooms, studying maps and intelligence reports. Radar stations tracked incoming formations. Every scramble could mean life or death. Geoffrey had trained hard, but training was controlled. Combat was not. He learned quickly that aerial warfare was chaos at 20,000 feet. Specks in the distance could become deadly in seconds. Recognition was critical. A friendly aircraft misidentified could mean disaster. Radio communication was often fragmented by static and adrenaline. The squadron commander briefed them. Enemy aircraft detected over the channel. Intercept immediately. Geoffrey felt his pulse in his throat as he walked toward his Spitfire. The ground crew helped strap him in. Parachute secured, harness tight, canopy down. He ran through the checklist from memory. Magnetos on, fuel pressure steady, throttle forward. The Merlin engine roared to life. As he taxied toward the runway, he could see the other Spitfires ahead of him. This was no longer practice. There would be no instructor's voice correcting him, no second chances. The signal came. One by one, the fighters accelerated down the grass runway and lifted into the sky. When it was his turn, Geoffrey pushed the throttle forward and felt the aircraft surge. The ground fell away beneath him. Within minutes, they were climbing hard toward the sun. This was his first operational patrol during what would soon be known as the Battle of Britain, a turning point in World War II. British radar operators had detected incoming German formations. The young pilots of 92 Squadron were being vectored to intercept. At altitude, Geoffrey scanned the sky. The world looked vast and strangely peaceful from above. Patchwork fields, winding rivers, distant coastline. It was difficult to imagine violence intruding on such calm. Then he saw them. Dark shapes against the light, a formation of enemy aircraft moving steadily toward England. His training told him what to do: maintain position, wait for orders, attack in coordinated formation, but his body reacted before his thoughts could fully catch up. His breathing grew shallow, his hands tightened on the control stick. This was no longer theory. He could feel the weight of responsibility pressing against him. Below, cities and civilians depended on the thin line of fighters climbing to meet the threat. Above, experienced German pilots, many hardened by campaigns in Poland and France, waited in disciplined formation. Geoffrey was 19. He had dreamed of flying. Now he was about to discover what it truly meant to fight in the sky. The squadron leader's voice crackled over the radio, calm but urgent. "Enemy aircraft, 11 o'clock. Stand by." In that moment, suspended between boyhood and history, Geoffrey Wellum realized something no training manual could teach. War did not wait for you to feel ready. It simply began. And as he adjusted his course and prepared to follow his squadron into battle, the teenager in the cockpit understood that whatever happened next would define him forever.
The radio cracked with a short, sharp command. "Tally-ho!" In Royal Air Force language, that meant one thing: the enemy was in sight. 19-year-old Geoffrey Wellum tightened his grip on the control column of his Supermarine Spitfire as the formation of German aircraft grew larger in the distance. The sky that had seemed so open and calm just moments earlier was now crowded with danger. Ahead of them flew a group of German bombers, steady and methodical, protected by fast-moving fighters, likely Messerschmitt Bf 109s. The bombers maintained tight formation, dark crosses visible on their wings. The escort fighters hovered above and around them like hunting hawks. Geoffrey's squadron leader gave the order to attack. The Spitfires broke formation and climbed slightly, angling for advantage. Geoffrey followed, trying to remember every lesson drilled into him during training. Keep your speed, watch your tail, never fixate on one target too long. Instructors had repeated it endlessly. But this wasn't a classroom. This was the Battle of Britain, and now it was real. The first streaks of tracer fire cut through the sky. It happened faster than Geoffrey expected. One moment the enemy aircraft were distant shapes, the next the sky was alive with twisting, diving machines. Contrails spiraled, sunlight flashed off wings. The roar of engines filled his headset, broken by bursts of frantic radio chatter. He saw a German fighter diving toward one of his squadron mates. Without fully thinking it through, he pushed the nose of his Spitfire down and accelerated. The Merlin engine roared as the aircraft surged forward. The airspeed needle climbed. The German pilot hadn't seen him. Geoffrey lined up the enemy aircraft in his gun sight. His hands felt strangely steady despite the chaos. He pressed the firing button. The Spitfire's 8.303 machine guns erupted at once. The vibration rattled through the wings and into his body. Tracers streaked ahead, bright lines converging towards the Messerschmitt. For a split second, nothing happened. Then he saw flashes on the enemy's fuselage. Smoke began to trail from the German fighter's engine. The aircraft rolled abruptly and peeled away, diving towards the channel. Geoffrey didn't wait to see if it crashed. Just as he had been taught, he broke hard to the right, scanning the sky. And that was when the situation changed. A warning shout exploded over the radio. "Brake! Brake! Bandits behind you!" Geoffrey jerked the stick sideways and slammed the throttle forward. His Spitfire rolled and dove, G-forces pressing him into the seat. A stream of tracer rounds flashed past where he had been a second earlier. A German fighter had slipped in behind him. Now the roles were reversed. The German fighter followed him into the dive. He could feel the aircraft trembling at high speed. He remembered another piece of advice from training. Don't try to outdive a 109 for too long. Use your turn. He hauled back on the stick and banked sharply left. The Spitfire responded beautifully, carving a tight arc through the sky. The German fighter overshot slightly, unable to match the tight turn. For a brief moment, he saw the enemy plane slide across his canopy. Instinctively, he adjusted and fired again. But the German pilot reacted quickly, climbing away and disappearing into the swirl of aircraft above. The sky had become a storm of machines. Bombers pressed forward towards their targets. Air F-fighters darted in and out, breaking up formations. Smoke trails marked damaged aircraft. Somewhere below, anti-aircraft guns fired black bursts into the air. Geoffrey's breathing was loud inside his oxygen mask. He realized he had lost sight of most of his squadron. Radio calls overlapped, some calm, some strained. "Watch your tail! I'm hit! Where are they?" He spotted a bomber slightly separated from its formation. Remembering his orders to protect the homeland at all costs, he angled towards it. Bombers were slower, but their defensive gunners were deadly. As he approached from below and behind, he could see the rear gunner turning his weapon towards him. Geoffrey fired a short burst. The bomber shuddered. Pieces of debris flew from its wing. The gunner's tracers flashed past his canopy, frighteningly close. He fired again, longer this time. Smoke poured from the German bomber's engine. The aircraft began to lose altitude, dropping out of formation. Geoffrey watched it descend, unsure whether the crew would survive, but he had no time to dwell on it. Fuel. He glanced at his gauges and felt a cold realization. In the heat of battle, time had vanished. His fuel supply was lower than he expected. Spitfires did not have long endurance, and dogfights consumed fuel rapidly. Another call came over the radio. "Squadron, reform and return to base." The German formation had turned back towards France. The immediate threat was over. Geoffrey scanned the sky one last time before turning for home. As the adrenaline began to fade, exhaustion rushed in. His hands trembled slightly on the controls. Below him, England stretched out peacefully again. Fields, villages, coastline. It looked unchanged, but he knew something inside him had shifted forever. He had fired on another human being. He had been hunted and had survived. As the airfield came into view, he lowered his landing gear and approached carefully. The Spitfire touched down roughly but safely. The aircraft rolled to a stop. When the engine shut down, the sudden silence felt almost unreal. Ground crew rushed forward, searching for bullet holes, damage, signs of impact. Geoffrey climbed out of the cockpit on slightly unsteady legs. Other pilots were landing too, but not all. Empty dispersal spots on the grass told their own story. In the debriefing room, the squadron compared notes. Claims of damaged fighters, a probable bomber destroyed, reports of losses. Geoffrey sat quietly, listening. He replayed every second in his mind. The first burst of gunfire, the Messerschmitt behind him, the moment he thought he might not escape. It had lasted less than an hour, but it had felt like a lifetime. He had entered the sky as a teenager on his first mission. He had returned a combat pilot. And though he didn't know it yet, something he had done in that swirling chaos, something almost instinctive, would soon draw the attention of his superiors. The war in the air was only beginning.
The debriefing room smelled of sweat, oil, and cigarette smoke. Maps were pinned to the wall. Intelligence officers stood ready with notebooks. Pilots spoke over one another, describing fragments of the same chaotic battle in completely different ways. In air combat, perspective was everything. 19-year-old Geoffrey Wellum sat quietly at first, replaying the fight in his mind. The squadron commander began moving from pilot to pilot, asking for details,
altitude, position, number of enemy aircraft, direction of attack. When it was Geoffrey's turn, he described the Messerschmitt that had slipped onto his tail. He explained the dive, the sudden brake, the tight turn. Then he hesitated. There was something else, he said carefully. He described the moment after he had evaded the German fighter. Instead of continuing a flat defensive turn, as standard RAF tactics recommended, he had instinctively pulled the Spitfire into a steep climbing spiral while still banked hard. And hadn't been calculated. It had been survival. In training, pilots were taught to avoid losing too much energy in vertical maneuvers at low speed. But in that split second, Geoffrey had felt that staying horizontal would make him predictable. So he had hauled back on the stick, combining a tight turn with a sudden climb. The result had surprised him. The Supermarine Spitfire, with its powerful Merlin engine and elliptical wings, responded aggressively. The German Messerschmitt Bf 109 behind him had attempted to follow, but overshot, momentarily losing position as it struggled to match the unexpected vertical angle. That was when Geoffrey had been able to reverse and fire. In the chaos of battle, it had felt accidental, but in the quiet of the debriefing room, it sounded different. The intelligence officer leaned forward. "You climbed while still in a tight bank?" "Yes, sir." "And he followed?" "For a moment, then he drifted wide." The squadron commander exchanged a glance with another senior pilot. The standard doctrine at the time emphasized coordinated attacks, maintaining formation, and using speed and altitude advantage carefully. Aggressive vertical spirals at low altitude were considered risky, especially for inexperienced pilots. Yet what Geoffrey described was something else, a hybrid maneuver, part tight defensive turn, part climbing corkscrew, unpredictable. One of the more experienced pilots spoke up. "I saw it. Looked like he was about to stall. Then the 109 slid right past." The room grew quieter. During the early days of the Battle of Britain, RAF tactics were still evolving. German pilots often used disciplined boom and zoom attacks, diving fast from above, firing and climbing away. Many RAF losses came from being caught in level turns or slow climbs. What Geoffrey had done disrupted that pattern. The intelligence officer began sketching the maneuver on the board. A diving brake, a tightening horizontal turn, then a sudden climbing spiral that forced the attacker to choose between following and losing speed or pulling away and giving up position. It was risky. If executed poorly, it could lead to a stall. But in the Spitfire, with enough power and precise control, it created a moment of confusion. Confusion in air combat was lethal. Over the next few days, reports from other engagements began to show something interesting. A few pilots, having heard Geoffrey's description, experimented with similar vertical spirals when under pressure. Not officially, not ordered, just instinctively. Some found it effective. The key was timing. Enter the maneuver just as the attacking fighter committed to the turn. Climb aggressively, but not long enough to bleed all energy, then roll over the top and reverse direction. It forced the attacker to react rather than dictate. In one later patrol, a fellow pilot tried it deliberately. A Messerschmitt attempted to stay on his tail through the climbing spiral and momentarily stalled, dropping its nose. The RAF pilot seized the opportunity and scored hits. Word began to spread quietly within the squadron. It wasn't yet doctrine, it wasn't in manuals, but pilots trusted what worked in combat more than what was written in training binders. Geoffrey himself was almost embarrassed by the attention. He insisted he hadn't invented anything, that he had simply acted out of instinct. But sometimes innovation isn't born in laboratories or war offices. Sometimes it's born in panic. Senior officers began reviewing combat reports more closely. They noticed a pattern. Engagements where RAF pilots introduced sudden vertical elements into defensive turns had higher survival rates, especially against single pursuing fighters. The Spitfire's design made it uniquely suited to this kind of maneuver.
Its powerful engine allowed rapid climb bursts. Its wing design enabled tighter turns than many opponents expected. The German Bf 109 was fast and deadly, but its narrow undercarriage and energy management in steep turning climbs made sustained tight spirals more demanding. By late summer 1940, as the air battles intensified, RAF tactics were already adapting. Pilots were encouraged to think in 3 dimensions, using height not just for advantage before combat, but dynamically during it. What Geoffrey had done instinctively became part of a broader realization. Rigidity in the sky could be fatal. Flexibility saved lives. For the 19-year-old pilot, the realization felt surreal. He was still learning, still making mistakes, still afraid before every scramble. Yet something he had done in a moment of raw survival had influenced how others thought about fighting. One evening, standing beside his Spitfire as ground crew refueled it, Geoffrey looked at the aircraft differently. The machine was more than metal and rivets. It was possibility. It allowed creativity, even in combat. The next day brought another scramble, another formation, another dogfight. This time, when a German fighter slipped behind him, Geoffrey didn't hesitate. He entered the climbing spiral deliberately. The move felt less like panic and more like controlled aggression. Again, the attacker overshot. Again, the sky briefly tilted in his favor. Over the radio, he heard another pilot attempt something similar. The battle above Britain was becoming a laboratory of survival, where tactics evolved not over years, but over hours. Historians would later describe the Battle of Britain as a turning point of World War II. Radar, aircraft production, and strategy all played crucial roles. But within that larger story were dozens of small human decisions, moments where individuals chose differently under pressure. Geoffrey Wellum did not set out to change air combat. He simply refused to fly predictably when someone was trying to kill him. And in doing so, the teenager who had once dreamed of touching the sky helped reshape how it was fought over. The war was far from over, but something had shifted, not just in the battle, but in the mindset of the young men defending their country. Innovation, born in fear, had taken flight.
By late summer 1940, the air war over southern England had settled into a brutal rhythm. Scramble, climb, intercept, fight, land, debrief, repeat. But beneath that routine, something subtle was changing. Inside operations rooms and briefing huts during the height of the Battle of Britain, RAF commanders were studying combat reports with increasing urgency. Losses were still heavy. The Luftwaffe remained dangerous and disciplined. Every tactical advantage mattered. And now, patterns were emerging. Several after-action reports described a similar maneuver used during defensive engagements, a tight turning break that transitioned unexpectedly into a steep climbing spiral, followed by a reversal at the top. The reports came from different pilots, different days, different fights, but they shared one common thread. The maneuver disrupted pursuing Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters at a critical moment. Intelligence officers began mapping these engagements more carefully. Diagrams were drawn on chalkboards, angles measured, speeds estimated. They weren't just looking at victories, they were analyzing survival. The Spitfire's design played a central role. The Supermarine Spitfire was known for its tight turning radius and responsive controls. Its Merlin engine provided strong climb performance for short bursts. What had initially been seen as a risky overreaction now looked like a tactical opportunity, if executed precisely. Senior squadron leaders began discussing it informally during briefings. Don't stay flat if he's committed to your tail. Use the vertical, but don't hang there. Force him to react. No official name was given to the maneuver at first. It wasn't written into doctrine. It spread pilot to pilot through shared experience rather than printed manuals. One afternoon, a training session was held between operational patrols.
Pilots who had used the maneuver described exactly how they timed it. The key wasn't simply climbing, it was choosing the moment when the attacking fighter had already committed to the turn and was least able to disengage cleanly. Too early, and the enemy could adjust. Too late, and it was fatal. Precision mattered. Some veteran pilots were skeptical. They warned that inexperienced airmen might stall their aircraft attempting aggressive vertical spirals. The Spitfire was powerful, but unforgiving at low speeds. A poorly judged climb under G-force could lead to a spin. So instructors began refining it. They emphasized energy management. Enter the maneuver with sufficient speed. Maintain throttle control. Don't overpull the stick. Keep sight of the attacker at all times. At the top of the climbing arc, roll smoothly, not violently, and convert altitude back into speed during the dive. Gradually, it evolved from instinct to method. Meanwhile, combat pressure accelerated the learning curve. The Luftwaffe adjusted tactics as well, shifting bombing targets from airfields to cities. Engagement altitudes changed, escort formations adapted. But the principle remained powerful: unpredictability. German fighter pilots were trained to expect certain defensive reactions: standard brake turns, shallow dives, predictable arcs. When an RAF pilot suddenly introduced a vertical corkscrew at close range, it disrupted the attacker's rhythm. In aerial combat, rhythm was everything. Reports soon indicated that pilots who combined horizontal turns with abrupt vertical elements were harder to track and harder to finish. It wasn't foolproof, nothing in air combat ever was, but it increased survival odds, and survival was victory. For 19-year-old Geoffrey Wellum, watching this evolution unfold felt almost unreal. He hadn't intended to contribute to tactical development. He had simply reacted. Yet now, during squadron briefings, elements of that reaction were being described as practical options. He listened carefully, absorbing refinements from older, more experienced men. What had begun as a desperate maneuver was becoming something more controlled, more deliberate. The RAF was learning in real time. Unlike peacetime militaries that could test doctrine slowly, Britain in 1940 had no luxury of time. Every engagement became both battle and classroom. Pilots learned from mistakes quickly because the cost of ignorance was measured in empty chairs at dinner. As the weeks passed, the maneuver's use spread beyond a single squadron. Informal exchanges between units helped circulate effective tactics. Pilots transferred between airfields carried ideas with them. Some accounts from later stages of the campaign described RAF fighters deliberately baiting German fighters into committing to pursuit before executing aggressive vertical reversals. It wasn't always dramatic. Often it was subtle, a slight upward tightening of the turn, but the psychological impact mattered. The sky over England had become a three-dimensional chess. German intelligence likely noticed something had shifted. RAF fighters were no longer as predictable in close pursuit. Attacks required greater caution. Overshooting became a risk, and in air combat, overshooting could mean death. None of this turned the tide alone. Radar coordination, aircraft production, and leadership were decisive factors in Britain's defense, but tactical refinement at the pilot level amplified those advantages. By autumn 1940, the Luftwaffe had failed to achieve air superiority. The invasion threat receded. The Battle of Britain entered history as one of the first major campaigns decided primarily in the air. Within that larger victory were countless micro-adaptations, small innovations born under pressure. The climbing spiral maneuver, refined and repeated, became part of a broader RAF emphasis on flexible dogfighting. It reinforced a cultural shift. Pilots were encouraged not just to follow procedure, but to think dynamically within combat. For Geoffrey, the war did not pause to celebrate tactical evolution. Missions continued, friends were lost, fatigue accumulated, fear never completely vanished before takeoff. But he carried something new into each engagement:
confidence. Not arrogance, not recklessness. Confidence that creativity in the cockpit could matter. Standing beside his Spitfire after another sortie, watching ground crew patch bullet holes from the previous day's fight, he understood something that no training manual had ever taught him. Innovation in war doesn't always come from high command. Sometimes it comes from survival instinct, sharpened by youth, pressure, and the refusal to accept defeat in a single moment. The 19-year-old who once climbed into a fighter plane with trembling hands was no longer reacting blindly. He was part of an evolving system, one where experience, instinct, and analysis fused together in the crucible of combat. And far above the English countryside, in the cold, thin air where seconds decided everything, a new way of fighting had quietly taken root.
When the intensity of the Battle of Britain finally began to ease in late 1940, there was no grand ceremony for the young pilots who had survived it, no dramatic moment when they realized they had changed history. There was only exhaustion. For 19-year-old Geoffrey Wellum, the months of relentless combat had transformed him in ways he barely understood at the time. He had entered the war as a teenager, fresh out of training. He emerged from that summer hardened, older in spirit than his years. But the war was far from over. The RAF began shifting from desperate defense to cautious offense. Fighter sweeps over occupied Europe increased. Engagements became more complex, more strategic. Pilots who had survived the Battle of Britain were no longer inexperienced newcomers. They were veterans. Geoffrey continued flying the Supermarine Spitfire, the aircraft that had become both his shield and his weapon. He flew escort missions, offensive patrols, and cross-channel operations. Each sortie carried risk. Each takeoff could still be the last. Yet something had changed in him. The fear that once overwhelmed him before his first mission had evolved into focus. He understood the sky now, not as a dream, but as a battlefield governed by energy, angles, and instinct. The maneuver that had once saved him in panic had become part of his controlled decision-making. And he wasn't alone. Across the RAF, dogfighting tactics continued to evolve. Pilots embraced three-dimensional thinking. They became more aggressive in vertical maneuvering, more willing to disrupt enemy expectations. The rigid early war formations gave way to looser, more adaptive engagement styles. Historians would later point out that air combat in 1940 forced rapid tactical innovation on both sides. Aircraft like the German Messerschmitt Bf 109 remained formidable opponents. The Luftwaffe did not lack skill or courage, but Britain's survival required constant adaptation, and adaptation often began in the cockpit. Geoffrey never claimed to have invented anything revolutionary. In later reflections, he spoke modestly about those early days. He described confusion, noise, and the overwhelming sensory shock of first combat. He rarely emphasized the tactical ripple effects of his instinctive maneuver, but others remembered. Within squadron circles, stories circulated about the young pilot who had pulled into an unexpected climbing spiral and turned defense into opportunity. Over time, the maneuver blended into broader RAF doctrine, becoming one of many tools pilots could use in close pursuit situations. Its true legacy wasn't in a single diagram or official manual. It was in mindset. The Battle of Britain demonstrated that innovation does not always originate from rank or age. It can emerge from necessity, from the refusal to follow a predictable path when survival demands something different. For Geoffrey, the psychological cost of war was significant. Like many veterans of 1940, he carried the weight of lost friends and constant danger. The adrenaline that once fueled survival eventually left exhaustion in its place. Years later, he would speak openly about the strain and vulnerability that accompanied those heroic narratives. Because behind every tactic is a human being. Behind every maneuver is a heartbeat.
The public would come to know the fighter pilots of 1940 as the few, a phrase immortalized by Prime Minister Winston Churchill. The young men who defended Britain's skies became symbols of resilience. But symbols are simplified. The reality was more complex. Teenagers learning to fight in 3 dimensions, making life-or-death decisions in seconds, adapting faster than textbooks could be printed. Geoffrey Wellum represented that reality. He had not been a senior officer, not a decorated ace at the beginning, just a 19-year-old placed in extraordinary circumstances. And yet, in one split second during his first mission, he demonstrated something essential about air combat. Unpredictability could be power. Initiative could disrupt experience. Instinct, when sharpened by training, could change outcomes. As the war progressed into later years, aircraft grew faster, heavier, more technologically advanced. Radar improved, weapons evolved. Air combat became increasingly complex, but the core lesson remained timeless. In the air, rigidity invites defeat. Flexibility creates survival. Long after the guns of World War II fell silent, fighter pilot training around the world would emphasize energy management, vertical maneuvering, and adaptive thinking. While tactics evolved with jet engines and missiles, the principle of forcing an opponent to react rather than simply responding remained fundamental. It's impossible to measure precisely how much influence one teenager's instinctive maneuver had on the broader evolution of RAF tactics. War is shaped by thousands of variables, but history is also shaped by moments. Moments when fear does not paralyze, it sharpens. Moments when survival demands creativity. Moments when youth meets responsibility in the thin air above a nation fighting for its existence. Geoffrey would go on to live a long life after the war, eventually sharing his experiences with honesty and reflection. He never glorified combat. He remembered it vividly, the noise, the speed, the friends who did not return. And perhaps that is the true legacy of a 19-year-old who once climbed into a Spitfire for the first time. Not just the maneuver, not just the tactic, but the reminder that history is often written in seconds by ordinary individuals placed in extraordinary skies. On that first mission, he had simply tried to survive. In doing so, he helped shape the way the war in the air was fought. And somewhere above the English countryside in 1940, between sunlight and smoke, a teenager became part of aviation history, not because he intended to change it, but because he dared to react differently when it mattered most.